This is Zan Fleming, CEO of Catalyst Institute, with my colleague Thomas Sir, Vice President of the Institute. And welcome to session 3 of this year's Targeting Healthy Longevity Conference. Loneliness is a pervasive threat to public health in general and to healthy longevity in particular. Now, we've presented this topic early and often, going back to the first conference in London in 2017, when Lucy, our moderator today, led a highly acclaimed discussion. But this topic reflects the wide scope of the conference, going well beyond drugs and other technologies to include every relevant consideration for increasing healthy longevity. So before we get started, just some instructions from Thomas.
Instructions. Well, it's a housekeeping reminder to enter any questions you may have in the Q&A function of the Zoom webinar platform or in the chat. Speaking of chat, we have enabled it. We encourage audience interaction. And just to warm it up, if you're willing, please say hi, indicate where you're logging in from, maybe your affiliation or your interest in the topic. But otherwise, back to you, Zan.
And thank you, Thomas. I'm delighted to bring on our distinguished moderators, Lucy Rose and Jeremy Abbott. Lucy and I actually go back many years to FDA days where she was a powerhouse, and she continues to be. But besides being an amazing FDA expert, she has developed a passion and articulation of the challenges involved in loneliness. And as mentioned, she got us started with this topic going back to 2017. Jeremy Abbott is another New Yorker and a amazing moderator in his own right. Lucy will say a few more words about him, but that's enough of me. Over to you, Lucy and Jeremy.
Thank you, Zan. And I appreciate you're not saying exactly how far we go back.
Indeed.
Powerhouse, I'm not sure. I certainly know you are, and thank you for having me. And it is not lost on me to see Big Ben in the background there and thinking about London in the first conference. Before we get started, I'd also like to add my voice in thanking you for having me and us and having this happen, but also to welcome folks who are not a part of the Catalyst Institute as well today. We certainly did a fairly broad invitation for this conference, and there's some of you who've not been involved in any of the previous ones, and we're really excited to have you join us today as well. And hopefully you'll really participate too, especially in our chat, and help us make sure that what we offer today, as best as we can, meets the needs of all of the different folks that are on the call this day. So if you do have a question or want further explanation, please let us know in the chat, and we'll do the best we can to try to make it relevant and meaningful for you, everybody who's a part of it. Jeremy, it's really great to have you. It's not lost on me that it takes two of us to moderate a session with Julianne. She's that powerful, clearly the guru in my mind on loneliness. So it makes me feel rather, weak and insignificant, frankly, to even be in the same call with her, in spite of whether or not I was the first speaker on loneliness for this. Thank you for joining us. And Jeremy, just for folks to know, Jeremy is the Vice President and Publisher of Scientific American. Does a whole lot of this kind of work for a lot of different folks and works very hard to help bring science to all of us in this country and around the world in ways that all of us can understand it as well. So without saying, I'll let him say for himself how important this is to him. I know it is. So Jeremy, I'm going to turn it over to you after one more thing. I have to acknowledge the fact that it feels really weird. We're speaking on loneliness and we're sitting in 3 different states, Julianne. So please, as we think about social loneliness today, I just bring that up before somebody asks us in the chat, what's the matter with you? We do recognize ideally we'd be in the same room and holding hands and being connected and all the things we need to do. But because of the nature of our work and all of that, we're in separate rooms and separate states. So Jeremy, I'm going to kick it over to you to introduce Julianne, if you will, please.
Thank you. And thank you, Lucy, Zan, Thomas. Pleasure to be here. We are As noted, physically separated, but socially quite linked up today. It is a pleasure. I'm Jeremy Abbott, VP Publisher of Scientific American. Really excited to explore this most important topic as it relates to health, to longevity, to the mental health conversation that has rightfully become an increasingly linked part of overall health and that conversation. I am thrilled that, as Lucy noted, we are joined by the loneliness guru, we'll call her. Julianne Holt-Lunstad is a professor of psychology and neuroscience and director of the Social Connection and Health Lab at Brigham Young University. She is also the founding scientific chair and board member for the U.S. Foundation for Social Connection and the Global Initiative on Loneliness and Connection. Her research has been seminal in our understanding of social isolation and loneliness as risk factors for early mortality. I don't think there's a better speaker to unpack this important issue than Julianne. So Julianne, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And I'm going to throw it over to Lucy to kind of start probing around this amazingly important and complex topic.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
We're the ones that are happy to have you here. And as I look at the chat, we really do have people from all over the world. I'm hoping you're looking too, Julianne, as we start.
I am, and I'm seeing so many from areas. I saw someone from my home state of Minnesota, people from the UK, the East Coast, Arizona, all over.
And someone here from Spain. So we have people that are having dinner as we speak, as opposed to lunch or breakfast as we might have here in the States. So thank you all for joining us from all over everywhere. It's a pleasure. And as we go through again, please feel free to use this as a place to ask questions. So Julianne, I think the number of people we're seeing here is indicative of how important this is and how important folks are beginning to recognize that it is, particularly post-COVID, as so many of us went into situations that felt even more isolated than normal. But as we get started, it feels like we really need to start with everybody having a shared understanding of what we mean when we say loneliness. So if you don't mind, could you kick us off? When I say this is all about loneliness, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, so first off, I hope rather than being known as the loneliness guru, maybe the social connection person. But you know, I say it in jest, but at the same time, these terms are. There are a lot of terms out there that are related, but are kind of different. And so it's helpful to have a common language and understand what we mean by all of these things. And so my work has been focused very broadly on social connection and how important it is to have people in our lives, people we can rely upon, and high quality relationships. And loneliness is a particular indicator of lacking social connection. And so it's often thought of as somewhat of even a biological signal that our social needs are not being met, similar to how hunger and thirst are biological signals that we need food or water. And so in that sense, loneliness can be adaptive, but it also is a very distressing feeling. But we need to be careful because it's also different than objectively being isolated. So if you're objectively alone or have a small social few social relationships or infrequent social contact, you would be considered isolated. And of course, objectively being isolated puts you at increased risk for feeling isolated or feeling lonely, that kind of subjective, distressing feeling, but they don't always coincide. You can be isolated and not feel lonely, and you can be in a room full of people and still feel lonely. But it also is different from other indicators of lacking connection as well, because isolation may be more related to the absence of kind of the positive, good side of social connection, which is different from social negativity, which is the actual presence of something negative and bad, or at least is associated with negative kinds of outcomes. And so I mention this because we often use loneliness very broadly to indicate all forms of lacking connection, but it really is a little bit more narrow than that. And it's important to note because we do, as humans, have social needs. And when those needs are lacking, it's associated with risk. And so loneliness is that important signal that helps us recognize that something may be lacking, but it's not the only potential risk factor.
Okay, so it sounds like it's not having your social needs being met to the extent that you feel distressed at some point, and it causes stress to your system. When that happens, just so folks can begin to get a feel of kind of the physiology that occurs with this as well, when that does happen, what happens in your body? What do folks actually feel from this? And why is this something that's concerning to people?
Yeah, so really, I mean, if you think about it, humans are a social species. And so loneliness can signal areas in our brain associated with threat. Because throughout human history, we've needed others for survival. And in fact, some neuroscientists argue that social is the neuro default. And so this can be a very threatening kind of position to be in if you're either alone or with people that you cannot trust or rely on. That can heighten a sense of threat, that can signal areas of the brain that can release, for instance, norepinephrine, that can signal in the periphery various areas that would lead to dysregulation of various biological systems. And so there's evidence to suggest that various biological and physiological systems operate most optimally when we are social and become dysregulated when we are not. And while that might be adaptive in the short term to cope with whatever demands that might occur in the immediate moment, imagine, like, I think many people are familiar with like that heightened, fight or flight response.
Yeah.
Imagine living like that day in and day out, right? And that can put significant wear and tear on our body when these systems become chronically dysregulated.
So let's think about that a second, because I can't imagine there's anybody watching wherever you sit, be it Spain, be it New Zealand, I think I saw a few minutes ago. Very cool, guys, wherever you are. There's probably not a person on here who's not felt that sometime, right? And when you do feel that OMG kind of moment here, and you get nervous and scared, your heart beats faster, cortisol is released, so your heart beats faster, you feel sweaty palms, you can feel your blood pressure going up. All kinds of things happen in response to that, in essence, fear, or in this case, stress of a different sort, perhaps. Feeling left out, feeling like you don't belong, something happening. And what you're saying, I think, if I'm listening right, is that what you have when you have long-term chronic loneliness is at least some degree of that happening in an underlying way throughout the entire aspect of that period of your life and what's happening, which causes then that inflammation perhaps to occur in other things that might result in some of the physiological things we see at the end of the day. Have I got that right? Is that?
Yeah, great. And thanks for putting it into clear and simple, understandable ways to sadly, us academics sometimes overcomplicate things.
I personally am not a neuroscientist. I realize that you also, not only are a psychologist, but in that part of the world. And I just want to make sure that everybody who's on is tracking with us, because, you can feel it. Even being a host for this, you can feel your palms getting a little sweaty, knowing that, people are watching and that is something important. And when that happens, what we know and what you've shown in your research, which is really important, is the impact that can have as we think about healthy longevity, which is what Catalyst is all about, the impact that can have then on your physical self. And we'll get to the emotional self shortly, but that physical piece, everything from your famous 15 cigarettes and the decrease in early, or the increase in early mortality, to dementia and heart disease and diabetes and other things.
Well, and I can also mention that this can also influence our behaviors too. And so we may not be sleeping as well. And we know how important sleep is to health. We may be more likely to turn to unhealthier kinds of behaviors, whether that's turning to our comfort foods or perhaps using substances inappropriately, whether that's drinking too much or other kinds of substance use to perhaps cope with the pain that we may be experiencing. And so there's not only what might be happening internally, but behaviors then, of course, can also impact some of those health outcomes as well.
That was the moment that really underscored it for me. When I got interested in this topic, it was actually through an organization. It was a company working on a social connection app, and they asked Scientific American to do kind of a data analysis for them. And one of the people involved, and it wasn't, it was actually the book by John Cacioppo and William Patrick, Loneliness, that came out, I think maybe 15 years ago. And it crystallized, and I'll quickly read you the passage that made me so interested in this topic. The passage was in early on in the book. Whether you are at home with your family, working in an office crowded with bright and attractive young people, touring Disneyland, or sitting alone in a Fleabag hotel on the wrong side of town, chronic feelings of isolation can drive a cascade of physiological events that actually accelerates the aging process. Loneliness not only alters behavior, but shows up in measurements of stress hormones, immune function, and cardiovascular function. And over time, these changes in physiology are compounded in ways that may be hastening millions of people to an early grave. And it was provocative for me, introduction to this world. But what you're saying is interesting. Having effect on sleep, having effect on eating, the need to soothe. So to me, the causality, it's a multifactorial causality and cascades, which I think, have so many components to them. I know that you're working on so many different levels, but wow, the implications of this are pretty massive for our health.
Absolutely. And so one thing I should point out is we have very good evidence of some of these impacts that it has on our behavior, right? But if you look at the large studies that look at how it eventually, as you say, lead to an earlier grave, it was important that they controlled for a lot of these, because we already know, of course, that, our nutrition is important, physical activity is important, all of these kinds of lifestyle factors are important for our health. And so what these findings actually controlled for that. And so the effects on mortality or earlier death are over and above any kind of effect that might be explained solely by these behaviors.
Right.
And so I don't want to dismiss how important that being a particular pathway, but it's not the only one. So there is importance to isolation and loneliness over and above these other lifestyle factors.
Right. Interesting.
And
Yeah.
in fact, the association appears to be close to somewhere between 26 and 30% of increased incidence of stroke and heart attacks as well, I think, if I have read that right. Again, controlling for all the other factors. Loneliness itself is associated with those. Direct causality, who knows, but certainly associated with that as well in terms of your work. So the impact is powerful in and of itself, even without the
Yeah.
other factors. There's what you're saying.
Yeah, and the other factor that I think comes up a lot is this really just depression?
Yeah, okay.
And so particularly with the studies looking specifically at loneliness, most of those studies control for depression. And so even though there are bidirectional associations between loneliness and depression, particularly at least when it comes to earlier death, we know that the impact of loneliness is over and above any effect of depression.
Wow. So, I mean, just to be clear, and going back to Lucy's original, ask about the definition, depression is a term that is used both colloquially, but also scientifically. And it would appear then that we're focused on almost the scientific definition of loneliness and its specific cause, right, as a driver of health implications solely. And that just that data alone is pretty provocative, and again speaks to things we'll talk about later: policy issues, awareness, education. But I think, to me, it's really valuable to grasp the idea that there is a scientific definition of loneliness.
Yeah.
I'd love to talk a little bit about international. I mean, you see reports about what countries are the most happy and what countries are the most content, and where does loneliness play into the larger picture of global populations culturally? And I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but is that definition uniform across, right, cultures, or what is the nuance when it comes to looking at global populations?
It's really important. And so thank you for bringing that up, because the one tricky part about it is, of course, as humans, we have social needs. And so that is something that is universal. But how we measure that, how we talk about it, how we express, all of those things can vary, right? And what's there's kind of exciting but also challenging aspects of this. It's exciting that we're seeing so much increased attention to this issue, but of course it's concerning because that attention is coming because so many people are struggling, and so it is critically important that when we are, say, for example, assessing loneliness, are we actually measuring the same thing when we measure it in the US if we're measuring it in, say, Zimbabwe? So many of our assessments were developed in North America. Most of the research is being done in North America, Europe, UK, primarily Western wealthy countries. There is more evidence coming out in low and middle income countries, and we are very systematically trying to identify and support research in, across the globe. But we are trying to be really cautious and careful to make sure that we are speaking the same language. I had actually a very comical kind of interview with where it was the interviewer was speaking Spanish. And although I took high school Spanish, I don't speak it well enough to, I needed an interpreter. And so I had a little earpiece, and the interpreter was telling me what this interviewer was saying. And I kept getting all of these questions about living alone. And so I'm answering it according to what I'm hearing in my ear. But really, what I recognized was that in Spanish, they use the same word for isolation, loneliness, and living alone, soledad. I might be saying it wrong. For those of you who are Spanish speakers, I'm sure you can correct me, but the point being is that there are some languages that don't have a different word for isolation and loneliness. And so even just in this interview, as I'm trying to talk about it, I would have had very different answers had I been talking about loneliness versus responding about what I thought were questions about living alone. And so we, as far as thinking about this on a global scale, we can't ignore some of those language issues, and as well as some of the cultural meaning. But there are several studies that have been doing this, and in fact, I was an academic advisor to the Gallup and Meta Global State of Connection survey that came out. They did a deep dive on 7 countries and 142 countries, I think should be released soon. And there is variability, but it's not something that is, say, uniquely American.
Yeah, thank you. And I note from, it looks like it's Fred, who actually talked about different places in the world where there may be less, or I'm going to think about the blue zones for just a second, Julianne, where, we've gotten some reports. There are pockets of our world where folks seem to live longer and healthier. And one of the things that constantly pops up at the top of the list as to the why is the social connection piece, which is fascinating, kind of looking at the flip side of this, how that, wherever it may be in the world, whatever we define or however we look at that, how living in positive social connection, since we're going to now call you the social connection guru, is a positive piece on health and life. So I reflect on that with you as you think globally about that. And thank you, Fred, for bringing that up.
Yeah, and I've regularly visited a couple of those blue zones in Sardinia, Italy, and Ikaria, Greece. I've been visiting them for the past 7 years each summer, and I see firsthand how tight-knit these small communities are, and they truly care for each other. And I think it is something that we can really think about as we talk a lot about establishing programs and things. These small villages are very modest. They have limited resources, but they look out for each other, and that's one lesson that we can learn is how just important even community is in really addressing this and changing how we interact with each other.
It's interesting. I remember reading John Capaccio's writing on Villages of 100, and how 100 seemed to kind of be a magic number where everybody felt like they had a purpose and that they belonged and were supportive of one another in such a way. And these blue zones, many of them are smaller areas, like you say, in the villages that you visited as well, where you can actually see that playing out. Which is really cool. I think we could spend a lot of time playing with that one. As we think about interventions, perhaps we can come back to that. But
yeah, I was going to say the same thing. When you look at animals, say, that don't get cancer, right? You see what is happening systemically that we can learn from. And I would think maybe the same thing happens in social systems, where you look at pockets of populations where there is social connectivity, longevity, happiness, and maybe you say, can we reverse engineer this and try to figure out what's driving this?
Yeah, and in fact, there was a piece published in, I think it was Science, where they looked across a variety of social species and identified a social gradient. It's fascinating because we see this across so many different kinds of species, and they document this evidence, and how and including humans, I should say, including humans among them, but a variety of social species, and really showing this social gradient of those that are more social and showing better kinds of outcomes, and those that are less showing worse kinds of outcomes. And in some cases, even experimental studies on these social species have shown that it causally influences physiology, health kinds of outcomes, and even lifespan itself. And so while we may not be able to do the kinds of experimentation in humans, we do have that evidence in other animals. And so we do have causal evidence in that, and among other social species, to be able to have some of that more kind of make stronger kinds of claims.
Yeah.
I'm going to push us back just a second. I
Yeah.
want to get to potential interventions and what they can look like, or as I say, potential treatments in quotes or whatever as we go, because there's so many positive things we can talk about as we get a little closer towards the end. But in building again the cause as to why this is so important. Julianne, I want to go back to your research about our 15 cigarettes that I kind of touched on just for a second and bring that back again, because I think that's such a powerful representation. I have never smoked and I don't know, but I think that's about like a half a pack a day or whatever that you may have been looking.
I don't smoke either, so I had to look it up. There are 20 cigarettes in a pack. I had to Google it.
Doing the math. All right, never mind. Again, well, we've proven we don't. But the fact is, can you explain what that means? I just want folks, we do have a lot of academicians on here, and we have gerontologists, and physicians who may understand a lot about this physiology. But I want to really get back just for a second to the real impact, but also to the numbers of people in this country that are impacted by this and who may be impacted the most. Because as we set the stage, this is not just, my poor grandmother sitting over here living by herself, therefore she's lonely. Because as we get to that, you're going to hear, whether people knew this or not, that the most at-risk group are actually not the elderly, but the young folks in our world. So let's go to the cigarettes first. And then if we can do demographics for a minute, I think that'd be great.
Yeah. So first off, maybe I can share with you a little bit of background. Back when I did my initial meta-analysis, looking at various indicators of social connection and how this impact mortality, I had been doing research in this area for a while, and many came before me. You've talked about John Cacioppo's work, but like many others have come before me. So I knew that there was research out here for decades, and yet the general public and the medical community didn't seem to really recognize social factors as being important for their health, maybe for their emotional well-being, but not necessarily health. And so in doing this meta-analysis, we looked at all of the data that was available at the time on this. And what we found was that higher levels of social connection were associated with a 50% increased odds of survival. And so I thought, wow, this is huge. But at the same time, I also knew, are people going to know what that means? or just how serious to take it? Because we're constantly hearing things, in the media, 1 week eggs is good for us, the next it's bad. And, we don't often, I think the general public has a hard time understanding just how to contextualize all these different health findings. And so we set out to benchmark our findings relative to other factors taken quite seriously by the public. And so we found other meta-analyses on these other factors, and we included lots of comparisons. For some reason, that smoking one just caught the media's attention, but there were many other comparisons. And so first off, I want to just say I'm in no way trying to claim that we shouldn't take these other factors seriously for our health, but rather just helping us put into context how important our relationships are just as much as we take seriously these other kinds of things for our health. And so, of course, I feel like I need to do an update to it because it's now old and there's newer data out now. But I want to just kind of put that into context so people know where that's coming from. And certainly, I didn't mean to offend anyone whose works or life's work is around smoking cessation, because of course we know that that's, I still remember someone saying something to me to the effect of, well, so does that mean as long as I smoke with friends, I'm okay? As if, these things cancel each other out, or that somehow, one overrides another. But, all of these factors are important. And really, it's just meant to help us think about just how seriously we should take this for our health. As far as, you also mentioned about some of the kinds of prevalence rates. And, one thing that's really interesting is that smoking has been such a public health success in the sense that we've seen dramatic reductions in prevalence rates of smoking. And sadly, we're seeing increasing prevalence rates of not just loneliness, but a variety of factors that suggest that people are less socially connected. And so I'm most familiar with the US data. So just as a caveat, what I'm saying is related to the US data. But so one thing I'll share with you that's, I think, was really compelling to me is I was looking at some recently published data from the American Time Use Data. And this is just where they track Americans, like, what are they doing during the day? And how are they spending their time? And one of them was looking at kind of social types of factors. And they had data from 2003 to 2020. So, roughly 2 decades. And what we see is dramatic kinds of increases in time spent alone, reductions in time spent with household family and non-household family, reductions in time spent with friends, reductions in time spent in companionship. And you see these trends happening across these decades. And so this is not unique to the pandemic. It didn't just start there. And it didn't even start just, the few years before that. And first off, it suggests that getting back to normal is not going to be enough because we weren't in a good place even before the pandemic. But we also can look to other kinds of data, like for instance, Bob Putnam's work that looks at social capital and how that, he shows even decades before that declines. And so it's not surprising that we're seeing such high rates of people reporting that they are lonely. And so, when you take together a large portion of the population that is either lonely or lacks some kind of social connection in at least one way and possibly multiple ways, along with these serious kinds of consequences, it suggests that we really need to be doing a lot more because the potential consequences and ramifications may be far and large.
Those are amazing statistics. And I just want to also say, in terms of the benefits or of a public health campaign, say to quit smoking, or and I remember years ago on TV, the campaigns against littering, very effective. But you had a very specific goal in mind. If you tell someone, smoking's bad, they'll quit smoking. Hopefully, right? That's the idea. But if you say loneliness is a problem and it's creeping up, because of the complexity of this, because it's not just about social isolation, I would think it would be a much harder or more nuanced campaign, because there's so many factors driving this. And as we know, it's not just about physical isolation or even some cases social, it's that subjective feeling. So I know we're not really talking about treatments yet, but I would think this would be a challenge even if we tried a public awareness campaign.
Julianne, I want to raise one more thing before you address this, because I want you to put one more layer on it, if you don't mind, because I think loneliness is so stigmatized. In our country, we were taught, you can do this, raise yourself up by the bootstraps. You don't need any help with that. Just this concept of rugged individualism, and you can do it yourself, or you're being selfish. You don't really need that. You can figure that out or whatever. And we found ourselves, much like so much of the mental health area that you work in social connections, we find ourselves to a great extent unwilling to say I'm lonely or to admit it. So how does all that play? How do we, when we get to the interventions, we can talk about destigmatizing as well. But in Jeremy's question, how do we layer that? How do we use that knowledge as well to help people be more open to talk about loneliness? What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, one silver lining of the pandemic is that it clearly demonstrated how this is more than just a personal issue, and that there can be external factors that can influence your loneliness, can influence how socially engaged you are. And so it helped, I think, a lot of people to become more open about talking about being lonely and maybe even their struggles in isolation or other ways. And I think related to both of these, both one of the recommendations included in the Surgeon General's advisory that I was the lead scientific editor on, we call for national health guidelines for social connection, just like we have health guidelines for sleep, for exercise, for diet. And in related to, I think, both of your questions is, and I recently wrote a piece on this on, like what would it take and what's the evidence to support these kinds of recommendations? And how might we go about actually establishing them? And yes, it is a challenge, but you think about even just the dietary guidelines. Think about how complex that is, right? And they weren't necessarily perfect, but they've been iterating. And as evidence becomes, more evidence becomes available, that those have been updated. And so we've thought about, okay, well, what would these guidelines be? Because I'll tell you, not only before the pandemic would I get all sorts of journalists ask me, so how many friends do I need for a health benefit? But then during the pandemic, I had journalists asking me, how much social connection and engagement and interaction do we need? Like, at what point are we going to start seeing all these health problems? Like, what are we supposed to be striving for here? And so the public clearly has an appetite for wanting to know at what level they're okay, and perhaps even what level they should be striving for. And so it might need to be kind of, here's where there may be some risk, here's what might be adequate, and here's what might be a goal to aim for, and recognizing that there may be some kind of continuum there. But we do have to be really careful, as you say, because if we say, okay, there's some evidence to suggest 4 to 6 relationships may be associated with a health benefit. Well, if you don't have that, we don't want people to feel terrible and shamed and all sorts of stigma if they don't. But how do we help people to feel empowered and in ways that can help them reach some of these? And of course, I'm just going to clarify, a lot of this, like I said, is on a gradient. So coming up with like a specific number is very challenging. But, I think similar kinds of challenges were faced with the dietary guidelines, in terms of quantity, in terms of making sure various nutritional groups are met, and taking into account age and differences and cultural differences, and all the different kinds of needs that might potentially vary, but nonetheless, the need for some kind of guide or recommendation, because this also can have important implications in terms of how we raise awareness, but also can potentially impact things like policy. Because if we think about what kinds of level of interaction, even just the minimum level of interaction that may be necessary, that can influence things like visitation among people who are in residential kinds of settings. It could influence policy at schools. And in most extreme cases, it can influence policies like solitary and confinement. And so we need to think about these recommendations as both helpful to the general public and how to raise awareness, but also make them empowering as well.
Yeah.
The analogy to dietary, sorry, I was going to say the analogy to the dietary guidelines is a great one, because I was thinking the same thing. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I really want to come back to that. I want to end and put a real period on your potential, your desire for guidelines before we end today, because I really want you to have the opportunity to share even more about how important that could be for us. I'm also noting all the amazing and wonderful questions that are coming in via chat, and I want to work one in right now, Julianne, that goes along with exactly, I think, what you were getting at, and one of my earlier questions as well about age and where we really see loneliness and where this is. And I want to bring up, and Wendy, thank you for this question. She said, wondering about the distinction between superficial and deep connections. And it makes me think about the difference between social and emotional loneliness as we think about that dichotomy, one being more quantitative. When you're talking about numbers is what made me think about that. How many friends do I have and what does that look like perhaps? And the other being perhaps more qualitative. What's your relationship like with your partner or your family or your best buds or whatever that may be? And does that help drive perhaps a difference in age? Let's start with the first question, okay, which to me is, where do we see loneliness and what demographics I think might be surprising? First, what percentage in the US are lonely of people overall? Secondly, where do you see that breaking out? And then thirdly, I'd love to tease a little bit about that emotional versus social. How about that?
Hopefully I can, I'll jump in if I forget.
A lot in while you can. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so one of the things that I should just be very clear is because we are all social beings, any one of us can experience loneliness and none of us are immune. And so I want us to be really careful about making assumptions about who is lonely and who is not, because sometimes it can even be leaders in our community, it could be celebrities, you name it. So we all have social needs, but some particular groups often face more barriers to connection than others. And so we do see different kinds of prevalence rates in different kinds of groups. So it was often assumed that it was primarily an older adult issue. And yes, we do see loneliness in older adults, but the highest prevalence rates are actually among our youth. Depending on the study, often either adolescents to young adults is where we see the highest levels of loneliness. But interestingly, in older adults, we see the highest amount of isolation. And so, and one thing I should be clear about is that we have very strong evidence that objective isolation, even controlling for loneliness, also puts people at risk. So we should not dismiss the importance of isolation, even if people aren't feeling lonely. Although loneliness can often co-occur with isolation. So in terms of age, we see that distinction. So now remind me because you had so many layers of questions in there.
I did. I was just testing your memory here. No, that's it. First, I don't know that we ever set the overall impact of loneliness in terms of percentages or numbers in this country. And you may have the numbers internationally or globally. I don't have those at my fingertips. But the percentage of people that indicate they are chronically lonely, are over 50%, I think, in this country.
Yes, and that actually
Not
that's
alone if you feel
difficult
lonely right now.
to, yeah, it's difficult to pinpoint because different studies are categorizing people as lonely or not lonely in different ways. And so in some surveys, they will include those who feel both moderate and severe levels of loneliness in those prevalence rates, and then some only the most severe. And so understandably, you're going to see larger prevalence rates when you include the moderate to severe, and smaller when you just look at the most severe. And so we do see evidence in the US. Some prevalence rates are above 50%. And in those surveys, again, the younger populations are even higher than that. But often when you look across the globe, a lot of those are looking more at the more severe levels of loneliness. And so those are a little bit smaller. Those can range anywhere from around 10% to, depending on the survey, they're a little bit higher or lower. But I've seen anywhere from prevalence rates from 20% to 75%. And, it might sound like this huge range, but it depends on like exactly those factors I just described. But also when you look at some of them, when you look at just the youth, it's more towards that 75%.
Wow.
Is the driver in the youth because of possibly expectations that young people should be social if you're not feeling connected? I mean, I just wonder if there some of the I don't know, the expectation driving that.
Yeah, some of the root causes perhaps that you may think for that.
Yeah. So certainly if we think about what is often a common definition of loneliness, it's described as the discrepancy between our desired level of connection and our actual level of connection. And we can think about what kinds of factors would kind of exacerbate this discrepancy. And so, of course, one of the factors that people look to a lot is social media, because it can often make everyone else's lives look more exciting. But we also have to think about that adolescence is a time when we expect our social circles to be expanding, whereas in older stages of life, we don't necessarily expect that, and in fact, often expect those to be shrinking. And so that discrepancy can be influenced based on those kinds of expectations. And in fact, there are some studies that ask older adults who would currently, according to the UCLA loneliness scale, are scoring high on loneliness, and ask them to describe a time when they felt the loneliest. And they'll often describe a time in their youth. And so there's also perhaps something about that developmental period, not only the expectations, but also there's a transition, particularly when we look at young adults. It's when a time when, for many young adults, they're leaving their home of origin for the first time. It may be a large disruption from even their community if they're moving away. And in fact, we do see across lots of studies that, like, these big life changes, if you move, if you get a divorce, if you retire, if you have a baby, all of these kinds of major life changes can often be trigger points for loneliness. And so we kind of want to think about youth as a particularly important time, because it's also an important time when and actually lots and lots of evidence shows that our early experiences have profound effects on later outcomes. So our early social experiences can impact later relationships, but also later health outcomes. And so the fact that this is so high among our youth should be particularly concerning for what we can expect decades down the road, because knowing how early life experiences are so impactful long term.
One of the questions that came in was, how are we defining young people? I know you talked about young adults and life changes, so I'm assuming in that sense it's someone in their early, to mid 20s. But then you also talked about adolescence and the expansion of your social network and the expectations there. So when you talk about, you're talking maybe 13, 14, even as young as that?
Yeah, so there are studies. So some studies will look at young adults, which would be the 18 to 24, 28. So that would be young adults. Some look at adolescents, which often you look at around 12 to 17. But some studies are a little bit narrower. But of course, this is important at every stage of life. And so even in childhood and even in infancy, those early life experiences are so important. And even, the social bonding that occurs so early in life is important. We're seeing the loneliness in our adolescents. And, depending on the study, so for instance, there was one study that showed loneliness peaked at age 19. But for instance, I recently just looked at the state of Utah BRFSS data, and they showed that loneliness peaked at among 10th graders. So, depending on the sample, it's that exact range might differ, but generally speaking, adolescence and young adulthood is where we're seeing the highest prevalence rates.
Wow. And what about the gradients you talked about? If I could just, you talk about scales of loneliness, and you talked about, surveys that would determine if one is somewhat or moderate or highly lonely. How important are those gradients to developing, our picture of the importance to health? And I think about alcohol. 1 glass is okay, but 2 starts to be a risky. Is there a direct correlation between those gradients and the health risks?
I love this question because, of course, we like to think of and speak as if someone is, lonely or not. But in reality, we're all somewhere on the spectrum from high to low, right? And same when it comes to, broader levels of social connection. And in fact, most research looks at it on a continuum, not dichotomously. And so that's really important. And what I found to be particularly really elucidating was there's some evidence that has taken large nationally representative samples across from adolescence to older age, and looked at how the different components, the structural, functional, and quality components of social connection impact various markers of health. And what they found was a dose response effect. And so with, in other words, as each level of increment of social connection increased, risk decreased. And they included things like inflammation, markers of inflammation, body mass index, blood pressure, waist circumference. There were some others as well. Also, some other studies have found that kind of social gradient. And so it's really helpful for us to think in that respect, because it also helps us recognize that this applies to every one of us.
Yeah.
I think we like to think sometimes when we talk about loneliness, it's like, oh, we need to help the lonely people, right? No, everyone needs help. And we all, um, you know, I think of it also similar to, diet and exercise again, in the sense of, some of us are doing better than others, but we could all probably do a little bit better. um, and that there are ways to improve that. And so I think it's really helpful to think about that gradient and think about where we're at on it and how we can make small improvements that can also translate to small improvements in health. Ultimately, of course, we'd like larger improvements, but at least those smaller might be more manageable for us to start working towards.
Like you said earlier, we're all immune. No one is immune to being lonely. And you think about it as gradients, Paul McCartney was right. Look at all the lonely people. I mean, we could all potentially be lonely. And that's, I think, an important part of this.
Well, and I'll add, if we think of loneliness as that, adaptive biological signal like hunger, it's a normal part of human experience.
Right.
I mean, it's like, who of us haven't ever felt hungry? Well, who of us have never felt lonely? Really, it's something we all experience. The issue is when we get stuck in a pattern, right? And we get stuck in loneliness and we can't seem to get out of it. And that can be more detrimental.
We've been talking about individuals and the impact on individuals and what that means. There are a couple of other aspects that I'd love to explore just briefly before we go into interventions and what they may look like on all kinds of levels. But the first one of those is productivity, even, because as we think about impact, we also have to look at what does that mean to us in overall cost to the country, both in a personal way and in family ways, but also economically. What does that look like? And as you look at the data, it shows $154 billion in productivity lost just directly from absenteeism from work due to loneliness. And that doesn't include less quality work when you are there or any of the other things that might be factored in, just absenteeism. How do we even kind of get our arms around that impact and what does that look like?
It's amazing because most adults spend the majority of their waking hours working. And so it's of course an incredibly important part of our lives, right? And so I think there's, in a sense, two parts to your question. One is, just how important are these kinds of work relationships? But like you said, beyond just, how does it benefit me, but how does it benefit society and even, employers, right? and how does it help their bottom line? Because ultimately, that's often what is cared about.
Our hybrid workplace today, and all the folks working from home, what are those implications? Yeah.
Yeah. And, I'm reminded of, a variety of studies that look at this and things that show, for instance, the more connected we feel to our workplace, whether that is, studies that show having a work best friend, or even just how much you are able to collaborate and there's more of a community of collaboration in the workplace, and how that can influence productivity. And this, of course, just makes common sense, right? If you like the people you're working with, you're more likely to work harder, feel more committed to that work. And so that, of course, benefits the employer. But it also can, as the outcomes that we talk about in terms of health, that can influence, if you're not healthy, you're going to miss more days of work. It's going to cost your employer, the benefits program, more money, and so it can have far-reaching kinds of effects. As in addition to, of course, when you're more connected and committed to feeling a part of that workplace, that that the kinds of work is going to be higher quality work. It's going to be more productive, and so the employer can benefit from that as well, and there's going to be less turnover. Because people are going to be more committed to that work.
Yeah, it's just, as we think about our post-COVID world, and we think about loneliness, and then we think about folks not coming in to work in the same way and losing that connection too, perhaps in a very real way. How does that impact both the individual as well as the larger workforce and what that looks like in terms of keeping up with all this productivity? It's an interesting thing, I think, for folks like you to be thinking about as you do research into the impact of all of that.
Right. And also thinking about the variability, when we think about remote work, the variability not only in different types of employment and workplaces, and also the variability in home environment, right? And thinking about both the promotion of our workplace relationships and our non-work relationships, and ensuring that we can create some kind of, whether it's, we call it balance or harmony, the workplace harmony, that we need to consider both of those as important contributors to our health and well-being, and they can contribute in different ways to some of our meaning and purpose. And so sometimes when we think and focus solely on, say, productivity outcomes, we might miss how that could potentially be taking away from our non-work relationships. But at the same time, if we are really emphasizing more at-home kind of work, we may not recognize where people who have home situations that are less conducive to that, or may live alone, they may be getting less social interaction. And so it's really complicated, and we need to keep in mind both of those important factors.
I was going to say, you can't dismiss one format over another just because there are workplaces where people are in person, but they're all on headphones or on virtual meetings. And there are workplaces that are more virtual where you're having a meaningful discussion. And so it is a nuanced approach, I guess, to assess. It's like dismissing one media format over another, without looking at the quality of the information.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many questions coming in, guys.
I know, it's amazing.
We had 3 hours here because they're all good, and I'm watching them go, guys, and I am seeing them all, and thank you all for sending them in. I'm going to try to bring some of them in right now, just to try to make sure that we continue trying to cover these. But one kind of goes to the other component here, that we've covered the individual, we've looked at work and work productivity, society on the larger scale. Mark asked a question about alienation and society and how all this kind of is playing out, and what might we see? Is there any data? Are you seeing anything that might have something to do with, and this has nothing to do with politics, I'm not trying to go there at all, but how we are interacting as a society and what loneliness may play into that, or how that might be causing more loneliness, or both?
Yeah, and they're probably, bi-directional there. And but it's really interesting because as we're spending more and more time in isolation and more time simply interacting with people who are like us, we often can have it can be a contributor to not only distrust in others and distrust in other groups, and that can potentially create some of these divisions that we are often seeing because we aren't often interacting with people who are from different backgrounds, different perspectives than ourselves. And part of that is being able to be out in our communities, when we engage with people who have differing viewpoints, we can start to see them as more complex human beings and see where we do have kinds of common ground. But if our only interactions with them are online, it may be more difficult to see them and the other aspects of them. And I'm not trying to just pick online, because if we're also only interacting with people in person that are only like us, that can happen just as easily in person too. But we need to be able to start engaging with people who have these different backgrounds, and so that's, I think, why there's such an emphasis on really looking at the importance of connected communities, and beyond just the individual, but how our communities are connected, because it ultimately can influence the health, the well-being, the economic prosperity, even the safety of our communities. And communities that are more connected show better outcomes on all of these levels. And so we need to start thinking about this from more of a larger perspective, and going beyond the individual level, because what might feel comfortable for an individual might create more of this isolationism, and that in part, I'm not saying the whole thing, but in part maybe fueling some of these issues.
Jeremy, can you bring us back there in just 1 second? Hold one thing, because somebody else asked a question and follow up I want to go to, but I want to then just piggyback on that as we move to interventions, so that we can think about what can we do about that, and hold that thought. I mentioned earlier the difference between social and emotional, and the quantitative versus qualitative kinds of loneliness, perhaps. And somebody has asked several times, and it's been brought to our attention, so I really want to bring this up to hear your thoughts on this. Is there any data that shows one is more important than another, that we should be thinking in terms of it's more important to build deeper relationships, or more important to have lots of them? Or is that so individualized, it's really hard? Getting back to Jeremy's question kind of about layering and what that looks like. Is there any wisdom here that you
There is. Yeah. So, it's interesting, because I spent probably the first decade of my career focused solely on looking at the quality of relationships, and how that moderated the kinds of effects that we see. And really, recognizing it's not just having people in our lives, but having high quality relationships, right? And so it was really surprising to me when I did my large meta-analyses that some of these more objective kinds of indicators of just, the size and diversity of people's social networks, things like living alone, which you would think are just such crude kind of proxy indicators of how socially connected people are, and yet they were incredibly powerful predictors. And so really what I think I've come to, so first off, I always go into data recognizing, like, I always have to be open to the fact that I'm wrong, right? Like, so what is the data actually telling us? And so what I've come to the conclusion is that having people in our lives, so things like size of social network, household size, these kinds of things, so having people in our lives is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And so that's why often these otherwise what might seem like crude indicators are so powerful, is because often these are the ones that are so stable. And so, but again, they're not sufficient. So just having people in your lives doesn't mean that you can rely on them or not. And so some of these other factors, in a way, build on that. But we do see larger kinds of effects for some of these more kind of objective, quantitative kinds of indicators. But I don't want anyone to take away, like, it's just, checking off the numbers of interactions or number of people, because truly, like I said, it's not sufficient. And so the quality of these relationships is really important. And in fact, we do have evidence that negativity in relationships can be associated with negative kinds of health outcomes. And so one of the big concerns is, with so much emphasis on loneliness, if we are pushing interventions that simply increase social contact without sensitivity to quality, we could potentially be doing unintended harm. We could be increasing conflict with people. So we have to be absolutely conscientious about just how important the quality component is as well.
So then what are some of the policies and practices, do you think, that might have the biggest bang for the buck to promote this social connectedness? You kind of were going there before I intervened with this question, but I really wanted to get that out because I think that is so important. But now what can we do about this? What are the things you've seen that we could be thoughtful about in terms of making the biggest impact? 2 countries even have ministers of loneliness now, I think, England and Japan, right? But
Yep.
what should we do?
Well, so in the Surgeon General's advisory that I led that work on, we include a number of recommendations. So if people want more information, go read it. I know it's long, but just we shortened it. So be happy. It was originally like 2 to 3 times longer. But I'll just point to a few things that are there's more kind of the structural and kind of systemic kinds of changes and policy kinds of changes, and then there's the kinds of things that individuals can do today, right? And so the kind of the bigger lifts, you mentioned a minister of loneliness, but having some kind of leadership position in the United States is one potential route to go. Not necessarily that they dictate how this is done, but to help provide leadership to oversee and coordinate what's happening on a local level. Because we know that there needs to be local sensitivity to any kind of work that's being done in this area. But there can be national kinds of approaches to, say, like the National Health Guidelines. But one of the things that I have written about is really kind of extending this idea of the health in all policies framework, of recognizing that all policies across sectors have implications for health. The same can be true for applying a social in all policy approach. During the pandemic, it became very obvious the social relevance of every single sector of society. Because when we had to limit our social contact, it impacted our work, education, our entertainment, travel, you name it, right? Well, if you were to ask people in the Department of Transportation, they may not see this as an issue relevant to them. And yet transportation is so important in terms of not only do people use transportation to get to areas in their community to be able to gather. And so having, safe and efficient and accessible transportation can really facilitate social connection. But things like roads can potentially be barriers too. You put a massive freeway through a community and it can cut people off from what might happen on the other side of that freeway, right? And so as we think about our existing policies and practices, whether that's at a government level or even within our own institutions or organizations that we are a part of, we need to think about how do these facilitate social contact or social connection, and in what ways are they barriers? And we can start by really evaluating what we're already doing and trying to first eliminate some of those barriers, right? So oftentimes it can seem daunting to create some new program or whatnot, but oftentimes we can just look at, okay, what are we already doing? Can we integrate that into what we're already doing? Are we doing things that are actually getting in people's way? um, sometimes it's just as simple as like, let's get out of people's way and let them so that this can occur naturally. And in fact, we have far stronger evidence of the benefits of when this happens naturally than when we try to kind of artificially create something. And so that's a huge step that we can do is start to eliminate some of these barriers so people can connect. So these are just some of the ways that we can start to think about it. But I did want to just share one other thought, and that is around norms, because we can create policies, we can create infrastructure, we can create programs, but social norms are incredibly powerful, right? And if our policies don't align with our norms, they're going to fall flat, right? So we think about like, okay, a lot of workplaces have a policy. It's like, oh, it's a 8 to 5 workday, but really the norm is you work until it's done, right? And so you think about what the norms are versus what the policies are. Often those norms carry far more weight in what actually happens, and so we need to start really thinking about the norms, whether they are the norms in workplaces, the norms in our communities, and really starting to model the kinds of norms, especially those who are leaderships within organizations, to model the kinds of social norms that will help facilitate greater social connection.
I note again in the chat, there are a lot of great ideas there. There are links to things, there are great ideas, great answers to some of these. So I hope those of you who are listening are also monitoring that. Thank you all for all of your thoughts there. Jeremy, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, it's incredible to think about. You think about what happened in the mid 20th century with the national highway system, and we were going to connect people, and the automobile was going to save America, and so much, at least where I live, right now I'm not there, but in New York, you had, like you were saying, neighborhoods that were decimated by these massive highway programs, and then people were isolated and cut off. And so you had, like most things, technology and progress can be a Faustian bargain. So you look at what it gives, but what it takes away. And it would seem to me that even just from an infrastructure standpoint, smart urban development and city development, town development would include not just physical ecology and sustainability, but that social ecology component. And again, that's just one aspect. As you note, there's so much more, right? Policy, infrastructure, there's social norms. But to me, when we're thinking about how we construct the civilizations of tomorrow and how we even look at things like the built environment, we take into account what this means for social connectivity.
Yeah, in fact, one thing that's always I note I periodically am over in Europe, and many of these cities are very old cities, and I come back to the US, and the one thing that becomes so striking to me is that many of the communities, or at least the community that I'm in, that many of the newer communities are really designed for cars and not for people. And so these older communities that I have been in Europe, they were designed and built before cars were invented. And so we are unfortunately not thinking about this as we design our cities and our communities, or at least it hasn't been. I know that there are many who are now doing incredible work and really paying attention to that. So I want to applaud those who are. But unfortunately, for far too long, it really was, as I said, often designed around cars. And you look at many American neighborhoods, and you drive in and drive right into your driveway, into your garage, shut the garage, and you don't see your neighbors. Often don't interact. There are many areas are not very walkable, and so it's it's not surprising that we're feeling less connected to people in our community when it isn't easy, and to connect in ways that just would naturally otherwise bring us together.
It is interesting, though, that we are beginning to see a movement, at least in this country, in that direction. We are also seeing some communities coming together and having their own block parties and celebrations and doing that. But architects now are beginning to design apartment buildings with staggered balconies so that folks can stand outside and talk with one another. We are seeing communities, I think of Reston Town Center, all of those years ago, which began putting a community together with this actually in mind. It's now also gotten so big, it's probably not a part of this thought anymore. But there is hope.
And did you see like how amazing it was when they needed more outdoor seating because, as a response to the pandemic, and streets became shut down, but they put in more outdoor seating, and how people were gathering, and how incredible it was when people were now given a space to do that.
Yeah, I think there is movement in the direction, at least.
Exactly. There's movement, and when I think back, many decades ago, when there was the rise in the gated community, and as you say, so much of our culture, our built environment was built for cars for a long time, and cars have had it nice. If cars were really social animals, great for cars. But unfortunately, they're right. We need to really think about what is that human connectivity, and not just in the built environment, but our online environment, and our, as noted, our work environment, the way hospitals, churches, everywhere people gather, to really think about what makes that social connectivity as seamless as possible. And as you know, Julianne, to get rid of barriers, to me, would seem the mantra of if we ever had a minister of loneliness in this country, that would be something, how do we get rid of barriers to make people able to connect better?
Yeah, and I think you touched on that a little bit earlier, but in thinking about even how we approach things like the environmental impact of a particular project or strategy, the economic impact, we need to be thinking about the social impact.
Yeah. Powerful.
We are approaching the end of
I was going to say, we have time for a few more questions.
Sorry, yeah, please. And Thomas's insight, I just ask everybody to take a moment and read that before we end as well. Talking about it takes time to forge connections, Julianne. This just goes right along with what I think you were saying earlier. If you don't have time or want to commit the time, it's really hard. Slow down, reach out with kindness and curiosity and caring. What a lovely way, Thomas, to kind of pull this together and think about that. And we are social animals, and we do need to think about that every day. Julianne, is there something you would like to leave us with after this far-ranging discussion on this? A piece we all take home or think about for ourselves?
No, I'll just add to, and I apologize because I just scrolled up, so I didn't get to fully read what Thomas had wrote, but I love that, and I think it also helps us think about even being kind to ourselves, and thinking about sometimes it can feel frustrating that our relationships aren't what we want them to be. And we don't often instantly have best friends or a close relationship, and those relationships take time. And it takes time to go from a complete stranger to an acquaintance, and from an acquaintance to a close friend or even a best friend. And so we think we should really be kind to ourselves in the sense that we're not a personal failure if that doesn't happen instantly. We need to be patient. But it also is important to think about how all of those little moments add up, and how important the over time and the consistency of that, and how we need to invest in our relationships on a consistent basis if we want to build and maintain the kind of relationships that we want. And ultimately, I remember something that my parents would always say, and that is, if you want to have good friends, you need to be a good friend, right? And so really take each moment to think about how you can reach out and be there for someone else, because even the evidence shows that often by helping others, we help ourselves too.
Yeah.
Great message, great sentiment.
Zan, welcome back.
Wow. I can't get over this. It's been such a unique and valuable discussion, and it sets multiple conference records. First, for such an engaging and enjoyable and rich discussion. The 90 minutes just zoomed right by. And then for the quality and quantity of the chat discussion, I just can't get over it all. I think we all have felt an intense sense of connectedness for the past 90 minutes, and how appropriate it is in this discussion about loneliness. So we can't thank Julianne and Lucy and Jeremy enough for this great discussion. And I know we'll be talking about it for many days to come. Just a few words from Thomas to close us out. Thank you
Wow.
again.
Wow, this sounds so mundane, but just to let you know, the next Targeting Healthy Longevity session will be on November 17th on the Cosmos trials. The largest trial you may have never heard of, controlled trials you may never have heard of, involving over 21,000 subjects on clinical cardiovascular and brain health benefits of a nutritional supplement and a multivitamin. So registrants will receive information in the email. And we will be distributing the link to the YouTube recording within a day or so, followed by a transcript and the chat log. So please stay tuned to the catalyst.org website, although registrants will get this information by email. And with that, I want to thank the speakers and you, the audience, for your attendance, and wish you all a good day wherever you are on the globe. Speakers and attendees, the virtual hall will be left open for a few minutes for those of you who are available and want to tarry. But otherwise, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Well, so
Thank
enjoyable.
you so much. Terrific.